The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The Republican replacement to Obamacare is dead yet again. Another major failure on the growing list of embarrassing and pathetic failures for both Donald Trump and Republicans. Dozens of House votes to repeal Obamacare under President Obama, when, of course, there was no chance that it would actually be repealed. A year of campaigning by Donald Trump and Republicans on repeal and put in a beautiful system that would happen right away. And failure after failure. This is the second or fourth failure, depending on how you're sort of counting them. Mitch McConnell wanted this done before the 4th of July. That didn't happen. Then he wanted it done before the August break. And it is dead once again. And why is it dead? It has nothing to do with Democrats. It is because Republicans who realize that legislating is tougher than campaign rhetoric have decided, at least a few of them, not to support this thing. Republicans Mike Lee and Jerry Moran joined up with Rand Paul and Susan Collins to oppose the bill. And then the math just made it impossible to even start debate on the bill. And the math is simple enough where even maybe Donald Trump could understand it. When you have 52 Republicans and 4 of them won't vote for it, you can't get to 50%. It's the simplest of math. And why is this happening? Because you can't move to the right from the Affordable Care Act and improve our healthcare situation. You can't increase access and reduce cost when you go from Obamacare to the right. Now, that being said, the Republicans that oppose the bill in the Senate mostly oppose it for the wrong reasons. Senator Morgan is against it because it only partially repeals Obamacare. Fine. I mean, I agree with opposing the bill, but that's not really a great reason to oppose it. Senator Lee said that the bill doesn't go far enough in lowering premiums for middle-class families, and it's not separate enough from Obamacare. Rand Paul is similar. He said the bill is basically Obamacare plus in some areas, so I can't support it. And Susan Collins had sort of the most reasonable reason, which is she wants to see a CBO analysis that's not as bad as the one that they got. What about seeing a CBO analysis that's good? Like, why would she support it if it was a less bad CBO analysis? But anyway, I'm glad that they're not supporting it.
And really, that list of Senate Republicans who opposed this bill was more than 4. Those were just the 4 that came out publicly.
Right.
It was probably something like 10 or 15. And I'm just confused because I remember after the House passed their version of this bill, Donald Trump had that big Rose Garden celebration.
Big celebration.
And he even said that if the Senate couldn't pass the American Health Care Act, that they would look like dopes.
And they do, obviously. Now, the question about whether they'll be held accountable for that dopishness is a different one. We'll talk about that later. What options exist now? They could try again for another repeal and replace bill. They could acquiesce to keep Obamacare, but make changes with Democrats to fix it. Or they could try to just get a straight Obamacare repeal and then try to deal with a replacement later, which Donald Trump has mentioned now a couple of times. Now, working with Dems to, quote, fix Obamacare is risky in a few ways. One is the ways that Republicans want to fix the Affordable Care Act are actually a disaster. Everybody likes the provisions of the Affordable Care Act, but not everybody likes the mandates and the taxes, and you need the mandates and the taxes in order to pay for the stuff that people do like. And it's also risky politically, because if you do negotiate some improvements to the Affordable Care Act, you then risk the political implications of allowing Republicans to say, hey, we improved Obamacare, which would really be a drastic distortion of the truth. It would be you utterly failed to get done what you promised dozens, if not hundreds of times, and you managed to convince Democrats to give you a couple of things.
Well, I think this tactic of just repealing Obamacare could actually work for them because then you still get those votes from the very right wing of the party, the Ted Cruz's, the Mike Lees, and you can afford to lose 2 moderates. And then in that vacuum, when there's a 2-year transition period, you can appeal to Democrats because they'll be guilted into it because everyone will realize that pretty much any alternative is going to be better than the pre-Affordable Care Act era.
Sure. Once you make the new status quo, Obamacare is gone and potentially 32 million people lose care, then you create much more of an impetus to actually do something. And Trump has been pushing that vote on a repeal only narrative. I told you about his tweet a few weeks ago. He also tweeted about this last night. Donald Trump tweeting, Republicans should just repeal failing Obamacare now and work on a new health care plan that will start from a clean slate. Dems will join in. That was yesterday. Previously, Donald Trump saying, or actually, no, this was earlier today, as I have always said, let Obamacare fail and then come together to do a great health care plan. Stay tuned. This could be a blessing in disguise for Trump and Republicans because obviously, health care wise, it's good to keep Obamacare if the alternative was the AHCA. But politically, it's less likely that Republicans will be damaged from failing to keep this promise than the damage they might suffer if 22 million people lose coverage. So even though it's a loss from a political perspective, it might actually be a blessing in disguise for Republicans. Not one that I'm cheering, by the way, just pointing it out.
It's very, very hard to take entitlements away from people. I mean, maybe there was initially some opposition to the Affordable Care Act, but now that it's been implemented for 7 years and people rely on it, good luck taking that away from people in rural areas across the country.
There is H.R. 676, the expanded Medicare for All bill. It was proposed by House Democrats in January. It's available, I'm just saying. The normalization is in full swing. The transition is complete. The days of there was no collusion, there were no conversations with Russia are over for the Trump administration. I warned you 3 weeks ago. The tune was changing on Trump-Russia from the right. The old position was there was no collusion. The new position is it's not illegal and everyone does it. A reminder, this is when we started seeing the tide turn. Britt Hume on Fox News was one of the first to use this.
But what crime?
Right.
Can anybody identify the crime? Collusion, while it's obviously be alarming and highly inappropriate for the Trump campaign, of which there's no evidence, by the way, of colluded with the Russians, it's not a crime.
So that was the old new position. Collusion wouldn't be a crime. The new position is collusion's normal. It's been months and months of complete and total denials that there was ever anything going on with Russia. Everyone in the Trump campaign has been saying it for months, if not longer. Remember what Kellyanne Conway herself said in January.
Did anyone involved in the Trump campaign have any contact with Russians trying to meddle with the election?
Absolutely not. And I discussed that with the president-elect just last night. Those conversations never happened. I hear people saying it like it's a fact on television. That is just not only inaccurate and false, but it's dangerous.
Does the president-elect...
And it does undermine our democracy.
Mike Pence, exactly the same tune that he's been singing for a long time.
Did any advisor or anybody in the Trump campaign have any contact with the Russians who were trying to meddle in the election?
Oh, of course not.
And now, the new position from the horse's mouth himself, Donald Trump tweeting yesterday, collusion is normal. Quote, most politicians would have gone to a meeting like the one Don Jr. attended in order to get info on an opponent. That's politics. Well, listen, things are going to go way more smoothly if Donald Trump admits that they did this. It didn't happen, but if it did, it wasn't bad. And if it was bad, Hillary did it too. And if that doesn't matter, then I wasn't personally involved. And if I was personally involved, I had no idea what I was doing. And if I did know what I was doing, I guess the voters deserve what they got.
Well, obviously, political campaigns look for opposition research, but where the difference comes in is where you get that source from. I mean, most campaigns don't look to foreign governments and adversarial governments for that information. And now you have people even like Chris Christie, who's a Republican governor, saying that that was probably illegal what Don Jr. did.
A dozen or so Republicans said, oh, no, that's not normal. I would not take that meeting. Do not allow this to be normalized. Their original position has evaporated into thin air. They now have a new position. The idea is very clear. It's a concerted effort to normalize what happened. You'll hear them mention Hillary Clinton's campaign and something about Ukraine. You'll hear them mention, oh, there was no crime committed. Trump has now fully embraced the position that they colluded with a foreign country, but that it's totally unremarkable in every way. And first of all, there is no one on the Trump team that is qualified to tell us what is normal, period, right? That's first off. If others did it, even if that's true, that's not a defense. You can't defend your killing of other people by saying, I'm not the only person who's murdered. You don't get let off of drunk driving charges because you aren't the only person to drive drunk. It's a red herring, and it is not something that should be considered. And lastly, as Pat is pointing out, it might well be illegal. We will hopefully continue to learn more over the coming days and weeks about that, but it well may be illegal. And it's really the Republican Party that should be ashamed here. I mean, just an absolute and total disregard for what's right. Will they stand by him indefinitely, or will they start to bail? Some are starting to go in the direction of bailing, and that's actually a good thing. In a frantic and sort of apoplectic attempt to take attention away from the daily scandals and the plummeting approval ratings, the Trump White House has now put together a whole schedule of themed weeks that no one actually cares about. It's completely silly. But lots of the weeks directly conflict with what Donald Trump and his family are doing. And my favorite is they've now unveiled Made in America Week. And the idea is they're going to promote the manufacturing of products in the United States. Unfortunately, this directly contradicts Donald Trump's own business practices, Ivanka Trump's own business practices. Donald Trump has outsourced production of his stuff, of very serious things that he produces, to any number of countries, everything from home decor to men's clothing. Remember this classic cringeworthy incident on the David Letterman show?
As a line of clothing. Now, where were these made?
These were made, I don't know where they were made, but they were made someplace. But they're great. It's ties, shirts, cufflinks, everything sold at Macy's, and they're doing great. #1 selling tie anywhere in the world.
#1 selling tie anywhere in the world. You wouldn't wear that shirt?
We also have them in white and beautiful white.
Where are the shirts made? Bangladesh.
Well, it's good.
Okay.
We employ people in Bangladesh.
Ties? Where are the ties
they
made?
Have to work
These are
too.
Beautiful ties.
They are great ties.
The ties are made in where? China? Ties are made in China.
Yeah, and it's not just Trump. Trump's daughter, who sat in for Trump the other day at the G20 at a table of world leaders, her clothing line is exclusively manufactured in other countries by low-wage workers in what I guess I would call questionable conditions, including Indonesia and Bangladesh and China, a specific target of Trump. There have been 2,000 shipments of stuff and things from other countries since 2010 for Ivanka's products that have come to the U.S. How many American jobs could that manufacturing have provided? And asked at Sunday's briefing whether Made in America would include a commitment from Trump and Ivanka Trump to make their products in the United States, reporters were told, quote, "We'll get back to you on that."
I just think that Trumpists will be able to excuse this. It's sort of like how he finds himself to be the best person to fix corruption in Washington.
Right. Because
as a businessman, he bought politicians, or that he's the one that can reform the tax code because he was able to use the loopholes to his advantage. I don't see this really sticking to the people who definitely support him no matter what.
You're right. It's total cognitive dissonance from the Trumpists. Last time I criticized the Trumps for this, people wrote to me defending them, saying, David, these are business people. They can't change the fact that it's cheaper elsewhere. They're just operating within the business environment. They didn't create the business environment. I'm sure if it was just as cheap in the U.S., of course, that they'd manufacture here. I'm probably being overly charitable here in terms of the eloquence of these people who wrote to me. I'm skipping the words Jew and cuck from my recollections of what these messages said when they were written to me. But that's the idea. Does that make sense to anyone? We're talking about a billionaire here. He can just afford to make a little bit less money on this nonsense and produce it in the United States.
It certainly doesn't make him sound like a leader now, does it? You know, even just because everyone else is doing it doesn't mean that he has to stoop to that level as well.
Absolutely pathetic. And every single one of these themed weeks, they're just hilarious. I mean, every single one is either representative of some kind of projection or it just makes no sense. They're just childish distractions from the endless scandals. Send me your thoughts about this. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman. We'll be back right after the break.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Gene Stanley. Gene, thank you so much for being a David Pakman Show member. We mostly are funded by viewers and listeners like Gene. You can sign up for membership and get instant access to the commercial-free All Access Pass, as well as the bonus show at davidpakman.com/membership. I still have 8. I still have 8 of those half-price memberships available. Marshall Bratz, a longtime viewer of the show, has sponsored half of 30 memberships. I've got 8 left. Use the contact form at davidpakman.com in order to ask for one of those. You can also make contributions at patreon.com/davidpakmanshow of as little as $1 a month. And don't forget, if you ever shop on Amazon, davidpakman.com/Amazon, stop by there before you shop, and everything you buy will send us a little kickback. Okay, major controversy because of something I posted to my Instagram account yesterday. Of course, I'm on Instagram at david.pakman. Some people are telling me, Pat, that they enjoy following my posts on Instagram. I posted a picture. Well, let's start first with my new swimming goggles picture. I do sometimes swim, Pat, and I recently bought new swimming goggles because I wanted, I open my eyes underwater, and because I wear contact lenses, I want goggles to protect my eyes underwater. I don't know what would happen to the contacts underwater without goggles, but I don't want to find out. And I posted a picture of me with my new goggles and comments saying that I look like an alien. And of course, no shortage of anti-Semitic comments. I don't know how goggles relate to Judaism, but apparently they do. And that's that. I mean, no shortage.
I think they're very spiffy. And do you plan on wearing them in your kitchen often?
Not often.
Okay.
Not often.
Just in this picture.
It depends on what I'm cooking. Yeah, if I'm making like a soup where there might be a lot of splashing.
Oh yeah, protect your eyes.
Maybe if I'm using an immersion blender or something like that, then I might wear the goggles in the kitchen. But for the most part, these will be for the pool. And then this is what really set people off. In preparation for my trip to my birth country of Argentina next month, I have like a bag of leftover foreign currency. I've got some euros in there and some Israeli shekels and whatever, British pounds. And I have some Argentinian pesos there. And I found that I had 70 Argentinian pesos. And I posted to my Instagram account, these 70 Argentinian pesos, when I was last in Argentina, were worth about $11. And because of the devaluation of Argentinian currency, these same 70 pesos are now only worth $4.13. And immediately, the Argentinians who follow me came out of the woodwork saying, David, that's toilet paper. And this is a lot. And I know it's not just Argentina that does this, but because Argentina has had currency issues for a very long time, I grew up with basically toilet paper is an interchangeable name for Argentinian currency. And that's exactly the situation now. However, a lot of people believe that it's laughably cheap to go to Argentina as a result. You see, it's like a nearly 17-to-1 peso to dollar exchange rate, so it must be super cheap. No, the economy is so out of control there that inflation is such that even with a 17-to-1 exchange rate, it's still as expensive as Boston or New York City, which is completely unaffordable on Argentinian salaries, I should tell you.
See, initially I was reminded of the Weimar Republic, where the German mark was devalued so much that people used it as insulation or kindling for fires.
Sure.
Because it was just practically worthless.
Yeah, and that's not, I mean, I guess, I don't know what the exchange rate was then compared to what's going on in Argentina, but people aren't burning the money right now, but people do use it sort of to mop up if you spill tea or coffee.
It's the equivalent of $4. You can still buy something nice with $4.
Yep, I could. I could get half of a coffee.
Yeah.
No, but in all seriousness, people have told me that if you go to a coffee shop and you get a coffee and a croissant, that it's about $8, which is expensive even by American standards in a country where the average annual wage is, I don't know offhand, but it's not a lot. I think it's like $8,000 a year or something like that. Should be an interesting trip. Let's put it that way. Donald Trump is taking advice from an 85-year-old boxing promoter. Over the weekend, a truly strange story slipped by some of us, and I want to tell you about it. 85-year-old boxing promoter Don King is allegedly advising Donald Trump. Don King is, I guess, a longtime friend of Trump's, and was sort of advising him during the campaign. And according to a Politico article, Don King is still advising Donald Trump. Some of Don King's credentials include having been found guilty of second-degree murder in 1966, ultimately reduced to manslaughter and pardoned in 1983, being investigated for connections to organized crime, over which he ultimately pleaded the fifth and being accused of having blackmailed or stolen money from a very long list of his boxing clients. And according to Don King, this is surreal. Trump talks to him about serious issues, like, for example, the firing of Michael Flynn. Here's an excerpt from this interview where Politico asked, what has Trump asked your advice about? And King responded, I've been to Mar-a-Lago a few times. We sat down for 1 hour earlier this year. He wanted to get my estimation of what's going on. He said, what do you think about me firing Flynn? I said, with all due respect, Mr. President, Flynn fired himself. Trump's loyal to a fault. He'll speak on your behalf because out on the street, you can stick with a guy and say he did the wrong thing, but he's basically a good guy. That's not crooked. That's not obstructing justice. That's friendship. So a lot of that was hard to understand and parse, but allegedly what Don King is saying is that the president of the United States went to an 85-year-old boxing promoter to get his opinion about the firing of a Russia-connected, lying national security advisor.
Can we be too surprised, though? This is the reality TV star president. This is the guy who wrestled on WWE.
Right.
This is the guy who appeared in a softcore porno for Playboy. I mean, it's not like it's beyond him.
And people will write in and say, David, it's a fake story. The White House has not denied it. The White House confirmed to the Daily Beast that Don King and Trump keep in touch, that they remain, quote, close friends with, quote, deep respect and admiration for one another. And a former Trump campaign official said that King is one of Donald Trump's favorite people who Trump loved talking about throughout the entire campaign. What world are we living in when a clueless boxing promoter is talking to the president of the United States about issues of international importance? Are these the best people that Donald Trump promised to put around himself? It's the dumb leading the dumb.
And also, why is King holding a Russian flag in that photo?
Oh, yeah, look at that. I didn't even notice this when I selected this picture. The picture we have up, that is the Russian flag, right?
Yeah, I think he's decked out in American, apparel, I guess you'd say, like the flag, the Statue of Liberty, all else.
And he's holding at least 2 Russian flags in this picture. I genuinely have no idea why in this picture Don King is holding multiple Russian flags, but
did we just find the smoking gun in the Russia story?
Do we know anything about this? I have no idea. I don't know when the picture's from. Very, very strange. Okay, so anyway, Donald Trump apparently still taking advice from an 85-year-old boxing promoter who is photographed with Trump holding multiple Russian flags, which makes the story marginally more pathetic. It doesn't totally change the story, but it does make it a little bit weirder. The lawyers of depraved, deplorable, and desperate, dishonest Jared Kushner are now trying to write off the fact that 100 foreign contacts have been added to the disclosure forms of Jared Kushner. Jared Kushner has yet again updated his disclosures, now totaling over 100 names that have been added since the original disclosures were submitted. He forgot to disclose more than 100 meetings. This is part of the process that's required to obtain a security clearance in the first place. Senator Chris Murphy, who's a Democrat from Connecticut, on Wednesday said in a normal political world, Jared Kushner would no longer have a job. That's true, but there's another layer. In a normal world, Kushner would never even have gotten the job of advisor to the president in the first place because it was pure nepotism, not experience, that got him that job.
And in a normal world, Donald Trump would not be president.
Yeah, we're not in it. Chris Murphy is naively talking about what would happen in a normal world. We are very, very far from a normal world. If you lied this much on disclosures required to get a job, like in the financial field, for example, in law enforcement, mostly anywhere, and people in charge are paying attention, you would be fired immediately. I mean, there's no question about it whatsoever. I know people who have been denied for internships, Pat, at financial companies and at the State Department because there were small errors, like truly just innocent oversights in disclosure forms, and they were denied internships. Here we're talking about someone with a top security clearance.
Oh, it's like if you say you're bilingual when you're not, you may not get that job. This is a whole nother ballgame here, and it's really difficult because it's not like you can impeach this guy. He would have to be fired by Trump.
Right.
And that's not going to happen when he's the guy's son-in-law. Ivanka would be very angry with him.
Yeah, what might happen, though, is he might actually have his security clearance revoked. Now, Donald Trump could override that, but, you know, I've heard various political analysts today saying if that happens, the blowback would be so severe of Trump overriding that he probably wouldn't do it. I'm not convinced. I actually think Trump might be naive enough to try to pull that. But yeah, number one, Kushner should have his security clearance revoked, period. Then we can try to figure out, to quote Donald, what the hell is going on. And there's two possibilities, and neither suggests that Jared Kushner should have a security clearance. Possibility one is Jared Kushner deliberately lied about 100 foreign contacts, and in that case, he shouldn't be working at the White House, period. The other possibility is that he forgot to mention 100 foreign contacts or forgot that he even had 100 foreign contacts, and in that case, it's sort of the same conclusion. He shouldn't be working at the White House, period. But the problem, as usual, is the provability of this. If we look at the law on this from the standard form 86A, that is the disclosure form, it says what you're basically signing on to is my statements on this form and on any attachments to it are true, complete, and correct to the best of my knowledge and belief and are made in good faith. I have carefully read the foregoing instructions to complete this form. I understand that a knowing and willful false statement on this form can be punished by fine or imprisonment or both. I understand that intentionally withholding, misrepresenting, or falsifying information may have a negative effect on my security clearance. It is difficult to prove that he didn't believe what he submitted at the time was false, right? You need to prove intent, and it is very difficult to do. And while he obviously, if he's this forgetful, he shouldn't be advising the president, that would not make it a crime.
I think Kushner resigning is the only way to get him out of that White House. And maybe at this point, with the Russia story adding up, his lawyers are going to start urging him to do that. It's just a real shame, though, because I don't want him to get led away in handcuffs before he figures out peace in the Middle East.
I know. We're going to talk about that later. And he is on the verge of solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if you believe Donald Trump. And it might be shocking to you to hear that. And it's shocking to me, too. This isn't good for Kushner. This isn't good for Trump. Do you agree, Pat, that Kushner is one of the most exposed Trump staffers to criminal prosecution?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Now, who is second? I think it's him and Flynn. Him and Flynn, I think, are the most at risk.
Paul Manafort.
Paul Manafort
Carter
as well,
Page, maybe.
We don't really know with Page. I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily put him on that list. Okay. Discuss this with us on our Reddit discussion forum, davidpakman.com/REDDIT.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
We're continuing our conversation with Dr. Aubrey De Grey, Chief Science Officer of SENS Research Foundation. We spoke yesterday about some of the latest science that you've been working on in different areas of study. If you Google your name, you will see that there are many, many people interested in talking about what they say would be the disastrous social, cultural, and economic implications of, as you say, curing aging. Just to pick one place to start with some of those criticisms, let's talk about overpopulation or population of our planet. On the one hand, we know that physically there is so much empty space on our planet, and that the sort of carrying capacity space-wise is orders of magnitude beyond the current population of our planet. At the same time, the population we do have on our planet has managed to do some pretty significant damage to the climate, pollution, etc. So what is your general perspective on the criticism that the planet would not be able to handle the damage done if we were to indefinitely extend human lifespans?
It frustrates me a great deal that these questions are so persistent. that people continue to raise these specters, as if they were problems that nobody had ever thought of before. Because the fact is, I, and of course many other people, have been giving answers to these concerns for a very long time. And nobody comes back and says this answer is invalid for this or that reason. They just, go quiet and go away, and then the following day they've got the same concern, as if I hadn't actually given any answer at all. So, first of all, let me yet again repeat the actual answer to your question, and then let me discuss briefly why I believe people have this cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
The answer, of course, is very much heralded by the way that you put the question. It's all about the carrying capacity of the planet as defined not by the physical space that the planet has to offer, but rather by the level of damage, the level of pollution that the average person inflicts on the planet. So if we take the most conspicuous example, which is, of course, climate change, we know that ultimately climate change arises from anthropogenic action, in particular from the extensive use of fossil fuels, as well as the various aspects of agriculture. And the main reason why there's no reason to worry about overpopulation in the future is because of other technologies that are coming along to address those problems, such as, for example, cheaper solar energy and other renewable sources of energy. Also, of course, artificial meat, which quite soon is going to actually be perfectly tasty, as well as having much less environmental footprint. One can look at other technologies that are slightly more distantly related, but nevertheless also have an impact, like, for example, desalination, which is becoming much more efficient. All of these things will add up to a drastic reduction in the overall environmental impact that the average person has. And that translates directly into a corresponding increase in the carrying capacity of the planet, the number of people that the planet can support without an unacceptable level of environmental impact.
I think that the one area, though, where I would say it's important to think about how that would happen in practice, I mean, what you're saying is, of course, not wrong. The question I have is that much of how our society is organized around energy consumption and the other areas you mentioned, much of that is driven by corporate interests. And so the question I would have is, if we were able to make great progress on curing aging, to use the term that you apply to the problem, there's no direct link between, people are living way longer, so now we will implement these technologies. There will be significant resistance from the major corporations that stand to make money from the status quo, and they're not really going to care about you solving aging, in a sense.
You're absolutely right about that. If it were a case of relying on society reacting to the problem by reducing our level of pollution, then yes, I would be cautious. I would be quite scared that there would, at very best, be a substantial lag time between the problem getting worse and the problem being solved. However, luckily, we don't need to appeal to that kind of logic, because the fact is these technologies are coming for reasons already. Solar energy, for example, is becoming more prevalent, not because we need to address climate change, but simply because the underlying technologies that deliver solar energy are becoming cheaper. And it's possible for people to make serious money by actually supplying energy, supplying electricity and such like, at smaller numbers of cents per kilowatt hour than can be achieved from fossil fuels. So it's going to be purely mercenary economics that actually leads us into this cleaner world, and we don't need to worry about any kind of humanitarian imperative. So let me actually now shift and tell you why I think this problem of the concerns that people have remains so prevalent.
Yeah.
But it's really crazy. I mean, let's face it, you don't get people saying that, they're in favor of Alzheimer's disease, or that they want other people to get Alzheimer's disease. This just doesn't happen, right? People are perfectly willing, with a straight face, to say, yes, all sickness is bad, and all medicine that eliminates sickness is good. But then when you point out that there's going to be this side effect, because sickness is the main thing that people die of, and therefore if you reduce sickness, you are going to have more people, When you point that out, they suddenly go all like, they flip and they say, "Oh dear, that will be a catastrophe," and they just can't see the cognitive dissonance. So I have to ask myself, what is the psychological barrier here? And to me, it's all about the fear of getting one's hopes up. People know that we've had aging since the dawn of civilization. We've been petrified of it because it's so terrible. And yet there's been absolutely nothing we could do about it. Moreover, there have been people throughout the history of civilization who have claimed that there is something we can do about it, and of course they've never been correct. And so there's a lot of caution with regard to either believing that this time we are actually going to get there, and also, of course, believing that it's going to be in time for you. So people just prefer to carry on believing that the whole thing is science fiction and coming up with these crazy, irrational means of putting the question out of their minds, trying to, rationalize aging away and pretend that it's some kind of blessing in disguise. It's really painful. And historically, it was a sensible thing to do, to put aging out of your mind, because it's ghastly and yet it's inevitable. And so, you've got to get on with your miserably short life and make the best of it. But now that we are within striking distance of bringing aging under medical control, this attitude is a huge part of the problem. It is the major reason why it's so difficult to bring money in to actually get the research done as quickly as possible and save as many lives as possible.
Well, along those lines, you and I have spoken a little bit about risk aversion. And if we imagine that humans had the possibility to live, just for the sake of putting a number on it, 500 years instead of our current life expectancy, would we not become incredibly risk averse, where if you bungee jump at age 50 now, you sort of know if it goes wrong, here's how many potential years of life I'm likely putting it at risk. If you could live 500 years, you're all of a sudden risking way more life by bungee jumping at 50. This applies to driving. This applies to whatever activity we're talking about. What's your sense of that problem?
It's actually the only problem, or alleged problem, for the elimination of aging that I ever took seriously. When I first started getting this whole thing, let's say 20 years ago, I thought about the risk aversion issue, and I thought, really, this is actually potentially quite an issue. But quite rapidly, I realized that no, it's not an issue, because the very simple thing, when something is risky, and we actually care about that risk, we have two options. One is not to do the thing that's risky, whether it's, crossing the street or whatever. And the other thing is to make the thing less risky. And of course, that's exactly what we're doing. The development of self-driving cars, for example, the main driver of that people always talk about is the fact that there will be far fewer accidents, quite apart from the fact that it'll also save a huge amount of money. And the same applies across the board. We would put a lot more money into vaccine development to prevent pandemics before they start. We would put a lot more money into searching for asteroids so that they wouldn't hit the planet, things like that. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to expect, that we would simply, as our risk of death from these things is elevated by default by the elimination of today's number one killer, we would pay that much more attention and throw that much more effort at it. Now, of course, what this does not address is the small minority of things that people like to do specifically because they are risky. Some people just like risk. And there's not a lot I can do about that. But it's a trade-off.
We've been speaking with Dr. Aubrey De Grey, the Chief Science Officer of the SENS Research Foundation. It's always so great to hear about the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you very much.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
When we talk about unforced errors for Donald Trump, the sort of unprompted and pointless and easily demonstrable lies strike me as some of the most damaging. 3 to 5 million people voted illegally. Obama wiretapped me. I had a record inauguration crowd. All these nonsense claims that are easily debunkable. And Trump has now made another laughably silly assertion. He's been saying for a little while now that no president has passed more legislation than he has, but he went even further yesterday. Now Trump says he has signed more bills through the legislature than any president ever in the history of presidents. Check this out.
In just a few months and moments, I will say what we've done over a short period of time and what we're going to be doing over the next 6 months will be incredible. We've signed more bills, and I'm talking about through the legislature, than any president ever. For a while, Harry Truman had us. And now I think we have everybody, Mike. I better say think, otherwise they'll give me a Pinocchio. And I don't like those. I don't like Pinocchios.
Yeah. It's hard to figure out what Trump even means by this, but the sort of primary thing that I'm gleaning is Trump might not know what a bill is. That's the big revelation from the video. And the truth is Trump is behind the previous 6 presidents in terms of bills passed during his first 6 months. Half of the things that Donald Trump signed were totally inconsequential, minor, and without any controversy. They still count, but Trump is still wrong. And as usual, one of the traits of pathological liars is that they lie unprovoked about issues which no one is even really expecting them to try to lie about, right? Like the number of people at your inauguration. Nobody was expecting Trump to try to deceive about that. And he comes out and unprovoked claims he had record inauguration turnout. So I think, number one, it's pretty likely Trump doesn't really know what a bill is. It's also possible he meant restaurant bills from all those dinners where, like with the Mitt Romney dinner where they had turtle soup and all sorts of other stuff. Maybe he means that they've been paying restaurant bills or something like that. Maybe he thinks signing executive orders counts as passing bills. I don't know.
I mean, I think you're right. It's not really even an indication on how well you're doing as president, because what matters is the merit and how good the bills are.
Sure.
And you'd think he'd be able to do a lot more because he does control both houses of Congress. But as you alluded to also, FDR and Truman were able to pass more in their first 100 days than Donald Trump has thus far.
Well, the main point, the first point is the big one, right? Which is, this is obvious to many of us, but maybe not to Trumpists. Success isn't measured by how many things you sign. It's what you pass that matters. And maybe Trump thinks like the memos are bills, since every time he signs a memo, there's a whole ceremony, and Trump must think, wow, I mean, there's a whole commotion around what I'm doing. Maybe this is a bill of some kind. I don't know. And to the point about what the merits of what he's passing a lot of things that are really, really bad. Like, for example, he signed a joint resolution which got rid of a rule that tried to prevent people with serious mental health issues from buying handguns. They got rid of that. That's not exactly an accomplishment that I'd be bragging about, but this definitely appears to be diagnostic. You know, it genuinely seems like he can't help himself from lying, which is one of the signs.
He has to be the largest liar when it comes to politicians in the United States. PolitiFact's scorecard of him rates him at 69% with false statements. And obviously, like, that's not the best indication because those are just the things they choose to look into.
Yeah.
But his rate of lies is far higher than any other politician that I can think of.
He lies big league. I mean, that's really the only way I can think of to say it. I love it when something happens that's outrageous and then you hear like a super understated response to it. And it is leaked that in a conversation between the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and French President Emmanuel Macron, Netanyahu admitted to the French president that he is, quote, skeptical of Donald Trump's Israeli-Palestinian peace efforts. Well, really? What made you so skeptical, Ben? Any reasonable person would be skeptical of Trump's efforts to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. His peace efforts have consisted of saying he's going to send his son-in-law Jared Kushner to the region to negotiate peace, which is completely laughable. And one of his first moves was to appoint David Friedman to be the U.S. ambassador to Israel, who unilaterally wanted to move the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which, if you understand the politics of the region, you know, would be a total impediment to the peace process, and is a supporter of more Israeli settlements, which is like such an unhinged, extreme position that it is a total non-starter if you're trying to get closer to peace, not to mention that Trump has no clue about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There may not be a single issue on which Donald Trump is less informed than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And also reportedly from this conversation between the French president and the Israeli prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu reportedly said the Palestinian issue is complicated. And Macron agreed, but replied, "You're making it more complicated by building settlements." And I say good for Macron for mentioning that. The continued building of settlements has to stop. It's an impediment to peace. And I know some people who watch the show like to call me a Zionist shill. Of course, they have no clue whatsoever what that even means. But I've been abundantly clear that the settlements must stop. Benjamin Netanyahu is also an impediment to peace. There is no reasonable argument for the continued building of Israeli settlements. And I've said before, yeah, if you're going to ultimately negotiate Israeli-Palestinian peace, some of the bigger existing settlements may have to be negotiated as part of meaningful land swaps. But you can't keep building. And Benjamin Netanyahu is right to be skeptical of Trump's efforts for peace, but everybody should be skeptical about Benjamin Netanyahu's efforts for Israeli-Palestinian peace. Palestinians are going to have to make concessions. I've said it before. There is absolutely no doubt about it to even get this process going. But that's not going to happen with Benjamin Netanyahu in power, who's aligned with extreme right-wing religious elements in Israel, and also, quite frankly, benefits from not having peace. Much of his re-election was catalyzed by the idea that it's dangerous, we're not closer to peace, and thus you need him to protect you. If you actually make progress towards peace, the need for a Netanyahu-like figure is diminished. So, you know, I applaud Emmanuel Macron here. I applaud Benjamin Netanyahu for his skepticism. Trump has no place whatsoever in this conversation, but there's also, it's not just Trump that's an impediment to peace.
Well, obviously this would be such a big undertaking, and it's something that if American presidents in the past have attempted, they certainly have not been able to succeed in doing.
Bill Clinton made some progress.
Right, yeah, and you know, you think about Jimmy Carter with Egypt and Israel as well, but just saying that you're going to send off Jared Kushner to deal with it is more insulting than anything else, and
it's
certainly
laughable.
doesn't make any progress.
It confirms that, number one, Trump doesn't know how complex the situation is, but it's also kind of patronizing to say, hey, it's been decades and decades, and there's been steps forward and steps back and complications and simplifications and armed conflicts and death and whatever, and Jared Kushner is going to just show up and be able to solve the thing. It's really patronizing to the people that have been working, in some cases, their entire lives on the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's just pathetic, and Trump has no role to play, in my view, on this.
And for Kushner, it's just one thing on his agenda. He has 5 or 6 other tasks.
He's managing like everything at the White House, and possibly soon will be losing his security clearance as well, which will certainly make these negotiations all the more difficult for Wonder Boy to participate in. We've got a voicemail number. You can call that number any time of day. If it's 3 a.m. and you want to call, you can call. And many people do call at 3 a.m. Those messages are sometimes a little bit more unusual than the ones we get at sort of more normal times of day. Here's an interesting voicemail. Someone called asking a question. The question was whether they would be able to ask questions at, I guess, some subsequent future point or something like that. Take a listen to this.
Are y'all going to let me? I got a serious question for y'all about political and stuff. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Listen.
This is John from Abilene, Texas.
John from Abilene. Okay. To answer John's question, we will accept any and all questions about political. I mean, he could have just asked the question.
Political's fine, but stuff, I don't know about stuff.
Stuff we don't want. Things I will accept questions on, but stuff I don't. Yeah, ask the questions. That's what the voicemail number is there for.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can call live as well. I would actually rather hear from John live next time we take phone calls. We do announce that on Twitter, twitter.com/David Pakman Show. And people, by the way, Pat, loving last week's phone calls where we had an unhinged Trumpist call in. We had a progressive woman who is married to a Trump supporter who admitted that his being a Trump supporter has caused intimacy issues in their relationship. Reluctantly so, but she did admit to that. So I expect that calls are going to only get better this week. So stay tuned later in the week. 219-2-DAVID-P is the voicemail number. We've got a tremendous bonus show for you today. A famed R&B singer and alleged urine fetishist, R. Kelly, is accused of holding women in a cult-like situation, according to what parents are telling police. Delta and Ann Coulter have had a big spat over something Delta believes is worth $30 and something Ann Coulter believes is worth $10,000 of her time. So we will see whether they can come together
meet her in the middle
on some kind of value there. And we will also determine, Pat recently alleged that he has 1 to 2 cups of coffee per week. I believe that his giant thermos contains way more than 1 to 2 cups of coffee. And we will actually measure it out on today's bonus show and determine whether Pat will be able to weather this scandal. DavidPakman.com/membership. Sign up and get instant access to the bonus show. You can use the coupon code IVoted17 for a 40% discount. And by all means, keep the Patreon pledges coming. We are approaching 1,800 Patreon pledges. Patreon.com/David Pakman Show is the website. That's patreon.com/David Pakman Show. I will speak to you on the bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.